It was a Sunday morning like any other in the quiet town of Magnolia Ridge. Families poured into the pews of Graceway Baptist Church, exchanging warm smiles and handshakes. The air smelled of fresh coffee and old hymn books. But that morning, there was an undeniable tension, a whisper of something dark just beneath the surface. By noon, the entire congregation would be shaken to its core, because by the end of the day, their beloved pastor's wife, Whitney Caldwell, would be found dead. Her death would leave the town with more questions than answers. Some called it an accident. Others whispered about something far more sinister. And as investigators peeled back the layers of Whitney's life, they uncovered secrets that no one saw coming. Secrets that might have cost her everything. Whitney Caldwell was the kind of woman who seemed to have everything anyone could ever want. At just 30 years old, she had the beauty, the charm, and the life that others envied. Her long, golden brown hair framed a face that never seemed to stop smiling. Her eyes, bright, almost luminescent, held a warmth that drew people to her. And as the wife of Pastor Elijah Caldwell, the charismatic and deeply respected leader of Graceway Baptist Church, Whitney lived a life that appeared to be a dream come true. The church itself, nestled in the heart of Magnolia Ridge, was an extension of their perfect world. Graceway Baptist was the kind of place where the congregation felt like family. Every Sunday, the pews were packed with smiling faces, many of whom had known the Caldwells for years. Elijah's sermons were always inspiring, packed with words that seemed to bring comfort and conviction in equal measure. His voice, powerful and reassuring, had earned him the respect and admiration of nearly everyone in town. Whitney, as the pastor's wife, was just as beloved. She had a natural ability to connect with people. From organizing charity events to leading Bible studies, she was the heart of the church's community outreach programs. On top of that, she took the time to make everyone feel seen and valued. Whether you were a longtime member or a newcomer, you were welcomed with open arms by Whitney, who made sure to remember your name and personal details about your life. Their life together was one of teamwork. Elijah was often busy with church duties, leading services, counseling members, and attending community events. But Whitney was always by his side, supporting him with quiet grace. They made an attractive couple, young, vibrant, and deeply in love. In their eyes, life seemed perfect. They hosted gatherings at their beautiful home, a charming, two-story house just a short walk from the church. The front lawn was immaculately kept, with flowers blooming in perfect rows. It was the kind of home that looked like something out of a magazine, always tidy, always warm, always inviting. Inside, the house was filled with photographs of their many adventures together, vacations, family celebrations, and candid moments of everyday life that portrayed an idealized version of happiness. Whitney and Elijah were seen as the quintessential Christian couple, living out their faith in every aspect of their lives. People looked up to them. Whitney was a role model for young women in the congregation. They marveled at how she balanced her role as a wife, a friend, and a leader in the community. It was as though she had everything figured out. To those who knew them, the Caldwells were a perfect match, their love strong and unwavering. But as much as their lives seemed flawless, something simmered just beneath the surface, something no one could see. Whitney herself was starting to feel it. She had begun to question whether her seemingly perfect life was as happy as it appeared. Lately, there had been subtle changes in Elijah's behavior, small but noticeable. He seemed distracted. His once constant affection for her had waned. The late nights at the church office were becoming more frequent, and when he did come home, he seemed distant, as though his mind was somewhere else. She started to notice the cracks that were slowly beginning to form in her own heart. The once easy laughter between them had become forced, their conversation strained. She didn't know why, but something didn't feel right. The man she had married, the man who had promised to love her forever, wasn't the same person anymore. Still, she held on to the life she had built with him, hoping that the cracks were just a phase. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing. That tension, That nagging feeling was growing louder with each passing day. To the outside world, Whitney Caldwell was living a fairy tale. But behind the scenes, she was beginning to wonder if it was all just a carefully constructed illusion. The morning of August 14th, 2023, began like any other in Magnolia Ridge. The sun rose over the small, picturesque town, casting a golden hue over the streets lined with oak trees. Graceway Baptist Church, standing tall and proud on the corner of Maple Avenue, looked as though it had been lifted from the pages of a storybook. Families gathered in the parking lot, chatting and laughing as they made their way inside. The service was set to begin at 10 a.m., but there was an odd, unsettling tension in the air, a feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. By noon, that dark premonition would become a chilling reality. The first inkling that something had gone awry came with the frantic 911 call that echoed through the small town. Elijah Caldwell's voice was filled with panic as he screamed into the phone, his words a jumbled mess of fear and desperation. "My wife. She's not breathing. She's cold. Oh, God! Please hurry." The dispatcher tried to keep him calm, asking for his location and details. But Elijah could barely make sense of his own words. The only thing he could seem to focus on was the horrifying sight of his wife, Whitney, lying motionless on the kitchen floor of their home. When paramedics arrived minutes later, they found the scene just as Elijah had described. Whitney was sprawled out on the cold tile, her body lifeless and unnervingly still. Her skin had already begun to take on a faint blue tint, a telltale sign of oxygen deprivation. No signs of violence were immediately visible. There were no bruises, no cuts, nothing that suggested a struggle. The kitchen was tidy, almost too tidy, as though nothing had been disturbed. Everything seemed normal. The paramedics worked quickly to try to revive her, but it was clear that there was little hope. Whitney was pronounced dead at the scene. Elijah, still in shock, was visibly distraught. His grief was palpable, his hands trembling as he held onto her lifeless form, muttering incoherent prayers. It was as if the world had fallen apart around him. The thought that his wife, his partner, could be gone was too much for him to bear. At first, the cause of Whitney's death was unclear. The paramedics suspected some kind of medical emergency, a sudden heart attack, perhaps, or even an accident. But the absence of any obvious wounds left them confused. When the body was transported to the morgue and the coroner began the autopsy, the results were both shocking and horrifying. Whitney had not died of natural causes. The toxicology report came back with a chilling revelation. Whitney had been poisoned. The autopsy confirmed that the cause of death was arsenic poisoning. The discovery sent a ripple of disbelief through the town. Arsenic? It was an old-fashioned poison, one that seemed almost too cinematic for real life. But there was no denying it. Whitney Caldwell had been murdered. And now, the question was, who had done it? At first, the police entertained the possibility of an accident. Perhaps Whitney had unknowingly ingested something contaminated, but that theory quickly fell apart. There was no accidental exposure to arsenic in the home. The investigation turned immediately to the people closest to Whitney, beginning with her husband, Elijah. It wasn't long before the whispers began. The townspeople, who had always seen the Caldwells as the perfect couple, started to question everything they thought they knew about the pastor and his wife. People began to recall odd moments. Whitney's strange behavior in the weeks leading up to her death, her noticeable weight loss, her increasing anxiety. Even more disturbing were the rumors that had circulated about Elijah's late nights at the church office, the mysterious phone calls, and the ever-growing distance between the couple. Could Elijah have been involved in his wife's death? It seemed unfathomable. Yet as investigators dug deeper into the circumstances surrounding Whitney's death, they began to uncover troubling details that suggested Elijah was not as innocent as he appeared. But what was his motive? What could drive a man, a beloved pastor who had spent his life helping others, to poison his own wife? The answers wouldn't come easily, but they were waiting to be found. The detectives knew they had to dig further, because the discovery of arsenic in Whitney's system was just the beginning of a twisted tale that would eventually expose the dark, ugly truth of the Caldwells' marriage and the secrets that lay hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life. As the investigation into Whitney Caldwell's tragic death unfolded, a haunting truth began to emerge. While the town of Magnolia Ridge had viewed the Caldwells as the epitome of marital bliss, the reality behind closed doors was far more complicated. What seemed like a fairy tale union had been fractured by secrets, lies, and unspoken tensions. And at the heart of it all was Elijah, whose grief and devastation were now being scrutinized under the harsh light of suspicion. Whitney's death wasn't the sudden, tragic loss that the town initially believed it to be. Instead, it was the final act in a story that had been unraveling for months, if not longer. For years, Elijah and Whitney had appeared inseparable, two halves of a whole. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form in their relationship long before that fateful night. Investigators quickly zeroed in on these cracks as they pieced together the timeline leading up to Whitney's death. There were subtle signs that something had been amiss in their marriage. For one, Whitney had been acting differently in the weeks before her death. Close friends and church members noticed a change in her demeanor. She seemed withdrawn, distracted, even a little anxious. The bright, radiant woman who had once glided through life with grace now appeared to be carrying an invisible weight. She had started losing weight rapidly, but she didn't talk about it much. Those who asked about it were met with an offhand comment about being busy or stressed. Whitney, ever the gracious woman, wasn't one to complain. But to those who were close to her, it was clear something was troubling her. Her closest confidants noticed her looking over her shoulder more often, as if she were afraid of being watched. There was an unease in her eyes, a sense of fear that was almost impossible to ignore. She had confided in a few friends that something didn't feel right, but she hadn't been able to put her finger on it. One friend recalled Whitney saying, "I feel like I'm losing myself. I don't know what's going on with Elijah, but something's changed. And I don't think he loves me anymore." At first, those around her chalked it up to the pressures of life. Being the wife of a pastor wasn't easy. There were endless church events, community outreach programs, and the constant demands of a congregation. But as time went on, it became clear that the problems in Whitney's marriage were more than just external pressures. There were deeper issues that no one outside the couple could see. The most troubling signs began to emerge when detectives examined Whitney's phone records. Text messages she had sent to a close friend just days before her death painted a chilling picture of her state of mind. In one message, sent late at night, Whitney wrote, "I feel like I'm being watched. I can't explain it, but something isn't right." And then, just 48 hours before her death, came another text that sent shivers down the spine of anyone who read it. "I need to talk to you. I'm scared." It was the kind of message that made it clear Whitney was desperately seeking help. She was terrified, but the reasons behind her fear were still unclear. Had she sensed something dark creeping into her life? Was she beginning to suspect that the man she had trusted with her heart had changed into someone she didn't recognize? And what about Elijah? To the outside world, he was still the grieving husband, the man who had publicly fallen apart at his wife's funeral. His sermons were marked by a deep, aching sorrow. He spoke often of Whitney's goodness, of the way she had uplifted him and everyone around her. The congregation rallied behind him, offering their prayers and support. But behind his tears and anguished words, was there more? Was Elijah, in his grief, hiding a much darker truth? Some church members, upon reflection, started to recall small but unsettling details about his behavior. Elijah had become increasingly distant over the past few months. He'd spent long hours at the church, sometimes returning home late at night, often without explanation. Whitney had started to ask about his late nights, but he would always brush her off with excuses. There was also the matter of the bruises. It wasn't uncommon for Whitney to joke about being clumsy when she had minor cuts or bruises. She was known to be a perfectionist, and it wasn't out of character for her to blame herself for the occasional misstep. But as her friends and family thought back, they recalled more bruises that didn't seem to make sense. She had once laughed off a large bruise on her arm, saying she bumped into a door. But when pressed, her story seemed a little too rehearsed, a little too quick. Had Elijah been involved in these bruises? Or was there another explanation? As detectives dug deeper into the couple's relationship, the question lingered in the air. Was Elijah's involvement in his wife's death a product of a marriage that had slowly eroded over time? Or was there something more sinister lurking beneath his outward sorrow? The unsettling truth was that Whitney had known something was wrong. She had been terrified, her intuition telling her that the man she had loved might no longer be the man she had married. And as those around her tried to make sense of her final days, the question became increasingly clear. How much of her fear had been caused by the growing, hidden cracks in her marriage? And had these cracks ultimately led to her tragic end? As investigators continued to delve deeper into the case, a new and unexpected piece of the puzzle began to emerge. It wasn't enough that the suspicion was already on Elijah Caldwell. There was a growing sense that he wasn't alone in the web of deceit that surrounded Whitney's death. The cracks in his marriage had hinted at more than just a troubled relationship. They now pointed toward betrayal, and not just from Elijah. The whispers around Magnolia Ridge, which had once centered on the pastor's grief and loss, now began to shift toward a new and shocking revelation. Elijah had been involved with another woman. Her name was Vanessa Hale, a 27-year-old Sunday school teacher at Graceway Baptist. Vanessa had been a regular fixture at the church for years. To many in the congregation, she was seen as a devoted, upstanding member of the community, friendly, approachable, and always willing to lend a helping hand. But as investigators dug into her relationship with Elijah, it became clear that there was more to their connection than anyone had realized. Vanessa wasn't just a casual acquaintance or fellow churchgoer. In fact, she and Elijah had been exchanging texts for months, many of them late at night, well after the church's evening services had ended. It wasn't unusual for church staff to communicate about upcoming events or Sunday school lessons, but these messages went beyond mere logistics. They were personal, intimate, and filled with urgency. The quantity of messages was staggering. Over 300 text messages between the two of them in just the 2 weeks leading up to Whitney's death. And as investigators soon discovered, many of those messages were deleted, as if someone was trying to cover their tracks. When detectives brought Vanessa in for questioning, she was initially calm, almost too calm. She maintained that her relationship with Elijah was strictly platonic, that he had been a mentor to her, someone she turned to for guidance during a difficult period in her life. She painted their connection as one of pure friendship, a bond forged through shared faith and a deep respect for one another. But Vanessa's body language told a different story. She was visibly uncomfortable, fidgeting with her hands and avoiding eye contact with the detectives. It was clear that there was more to the story than she was letting on. As the hours wore on and the pressure mounted, Vanessa's defenses began to crack. She finally admitted that she and Elijah had been involved in a romantic affair for months. It wasn't just a brief fling or a momentary lapse in judgment. It had been a full-fledged relationship, one that had consumed both of them. Vanessa described their connection as something intense, something that she believed had the potential to blossom into something even more serious. But there was something even more disturbing beneath the surface of her confession. Vanessa explained that Elijah had confided in her about the state of his marriage. He told her that his wife, Whitney, had grown distant and that their relationship was falling apart. Elijah had described his wife as controlling, and he expressed his frustration over the way Whitney had been increasingly critical of him. According to Vanessa, Elijah felt trapped in a marriage that was suffocating him, and that ultimately he believed Whitney was the one standing in the way of his happiness. What stood out most in Vanessa's testimony, however, was the day before Whitney's death. Vanessa had, in a moment of shockingly cold practicality, conducted an internet search that would later send chills down the spine of anyone who heard about it. Just hours before Whitney's death, Vanessa had searched the phrase, "How long does arsenic take to kill?" At first glance, it seemed like a trivial, almost harmless query, someone curious about a topic they knew little about. But considering the circumstances surrounding Whitney's death, this search was far from innocent. It was a disturbing piece of the puzzle. Why would Vanessa, a woman who had only recently begun an affair with Elijah, be researching arsenic? The timing of the search, coupled with the fact that Whitney's toxicology report later confirmed that she had been poisoned with arsenic, left little room for doubt. Vanessa's involvement in the crime seemed more than just incidental. In fact, it appeared as though she had played an active role in orchestrating the murder. But why? Why would Vanessa, who, on the surface, seemed like an innocent woman just seeking guidance, be involved in the death of another woman? The answer, according to investigators, was as simple as it was chilling. Vanessa had fallen in love with Elijah, and she wanted Whitney out of the picture. The truth was that Vanessa was deeply obsessed with Elijah. She saw him as a man who could give her the life she wanted, one of influence, respect, and power. And when she learned that Elijah was married to Whitney, the woman who had everything that Vanessa desired, a dangerous jealousy began to take root. The affair, which started as an escape for both Elijah and Vanessa, had become something far more toxic and destructive. Vanessa believed that if Whitney were out of the picture, Elijah would finally be hers, completely. What had started as a simple emotional affair had turned into a deadly plot, one that would ultimately claim Whitney Caldwell's life. And as investigators connected the dots between Vanessa's suspicious behavior, the deleted text messages, and her chilling search for information on arsenic, they knew they were dealing with something far darker than just an affair gone wrong. Vanessa had become obsessed with a life she could never have, one that she believed could only be obtained by eliminating the woman who stood in her way. And now, the truth was becoming all too clear. Vanessa Hale was not the innocent church teacher she had once appeared to be. As the investigation continued to unfold, the tension surrounding Elijah Caldwell reached a boiling point. It was one thing for the town of Magnolia Ridge to gossip about the pastor's secret affair, but it was another entirely for Elijah to be confronted with mounting evidence that his actions had led to his wife's death. The web of lies, deceit, and betrayal that had once been hidden behind closed doors was now being pulled into the harsh light of the investigation, and there was no escaping the consequences. By the time detectives sat down with Elijah for a final round of questioning, they had already amassed a mountain of evidence against him. There was his affair with Vanessa Hale, his wife's troubling texts, and most damning of all, the discovery that Whitney had been poisoned with arsenic. Elijah had tried to keep up the facade of a grieving husband, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to deny the reality of his involvement in the tragic events. For hours, Elijah clung to his innocence, continuing to deny any wrongdoing. His grief was palpable, his voice cracking with emotion as he spoke about the love he had for his wife, the pain he felt at her loss, and the deep sense of betrayal he experienced when he had learned that Whitney had discovered his affair. But as the detectives methodically presented their evidence, cracks began to appear in Elijah's carefully constructed defense. First, there was the matter of the affair itself. Elijah had never admitted to the affair with Vanessa during his previous interviews, but the evidence was irrefutable. The phone records, the text messages, and Vanessa's own testimony all pointed to the same conclusion. Elijah had been involved with another woman, and not just for a short period of time. This was an affair that had consumed him, a secret that he had kept hidden from his wife for months. When detectives confronted Elijah with the evidence, he remained steadfast in his denials, insisting that his relationship with Vanessa had been nothing more than a friendship. But the longer the questioning continued, the more Elijah's composure began to unravel. Finally, in a moment of desperation, he admitted to the affair, but he swore that it had nothing to do with Whitney's death. "It was a mistake," Elijah said, his voice shaky. "I never meant for it to get this far, but I loved her, both of them. Whitney was my wife, and I never wanted to hurt her. Vanessa, she was someone I turned to, someone who understood me when I felt lost. But I never would have hurt Whitney. It was a confession of sorts, but it still wasn't enough." Elijah's tears were genuine, but so was the mounting evidence against him. There were just too many inconsistencies in his story. If he truly hadn't wanted to hurt his wife, why had he failed to tell her the truth about the affair? Why had he lied to her when she confronted him, instead of coming clean and trying to salvage their marriage? And then the final, most shocking revelation came, a confession that would change everything. With the detectives continuing to press him, Elijah finally broke. He admitted that the night before Whitney's death, the two had had a confrontation. Whitney had discovered his affair with Vanessa and had demanded that he choose between her and the woman he had been seeing. She had been angry, hurt, and betrayed. But what followed was perhaps the most telling moment of all. Elijah admitted with chilling calmness that Whitney had threatened to leave him. She had told him that she would take everything, his home, his ministry, his reputation, and that she would expose his affair to the entire congregation. She had said that she would leave him for good, taking their life and everything he held dear. And, according to Elijah, this was the breaking point. She was angry, Elijah said in a hushed voice, his eyes downcast. She said she was leaving me. I begged her not to. I told her I'd do anything, but she wouldn't listen. She said it was over. Had this been the final straw for Elijah? Had the thought of losing everything, the woman he loved, his marriage, his career, driven him to the unthinkable? I didn't want to lose her, he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. But I couldn't let her ruin my life. She was the one thing standing between me and everything I wanted. If she left, everything would fall apart. Elijah's words were damning in their simplicity. He hadn't just lost control. He had allowed his fear of losing everything to cloud his judgment. The affair with Vanessa had already been a betrayal of the highest order, but it was Whitney's refusal to forgive him, her ultimatum, that seemed to tip the scales toward a more dangerous path. Had this confrontation, filled with anger, fear, and desperation, been the catalyst for Whitney's tragic death? Elijah's confession suggested that, in a moment of irrational panic, he had resorted to something far darker than just emotional manipulation or lies. But was it enough to push him to commit murder? As the detectives listened to Elijah's confession, they were left with more questions than answers. Elijah had admitted to the affair, and he had openly acknowledged that Whitney had threatened to leave him. But had this confrontation been the reason for her death? Or had there been another, more calculated motive at play? But one thing was now crystal clear. Elijah had known Whitney was serious about leaving him. He had known that the marriage was unraveling, and he had done whatever it took to prevent it from falling apart, no matter the cost. And as the investigators sat back, piecing together the broken fragments of Elijah's confession, the final part of the puzzle began to fall into place. This was no longer just a case of infidelity gone wrong. It was a story of fear, betrayal, and ultimately murder. There was more. When the investigators examined the church's security footage, they discovered something chilling, something that would send a shiver down anyone's spine. On the night before Whitney's death, at exactly 2:37 a.m., Elijah was captured on camera sneaking out of the church office. He didn't appear to be in a hurry, but he was clearly trying to avoid being seen. And what was more concerning was where he went next. The footage showed Elijah driving to a house not far from the church. It was a house that belonged to none other than Vanessa Hale, the woman with whom Elijah had been having the affair, the same woman who had been researching how long arsenic took to kill. Elijah stayed at Vanessa's house for exactly 42 minutes. What happened during that time? What was discussed? The investigators didn't know for sure, but the timing, combined with the fact that Elijah had just purchased the arsenic, pointed to a dark possibility. Vanessa and Elijah had been working together to carry out the murder of Whitney. As the investigation continued, Vanessa's involvement became more and more apparent. Despite her initial claims of innocence, the evidence against her was overwhelming. She had researched arsenic online. She had been in communication with Elijah the night before Whitney's death. And now, it seemed, the two had conspired together to kill Whitney. But there was something more to the story, something even darker than anyone could have imagined. Under pressure, Vanessa finally cracked. She broke down and confessed everything. With tears streaming down her face, Vanessa revealed the twisted truth. Elijah had come to her the night before Whitney's death, telling her that his wife had found out about the affair. Whitney had confronted him, demanding that he choose between her and Vanessa. Elijah had begged her to stay, promising that he would end things with Vanessa. But when it became clear that Whitney was serious about leaving him, Elijah snapped. He told Vanessa that he couldn't let Whitney ruin everything he had built: the church, his career, his reputation. Vanessa had listened horrified as Elijah outlined his plan. He told her that Whitney had to be removed from the picture. It wasn't just about keeping his marriage intact. It was about preserving his status, his position, and his life. Elijah had convinced Vanessa that the only way forward was to eliminate Whitney. And in that moment, Vanessa had agreed to help him. Vanessa's confession was the final piece of the puzzle. The murder had been a joint effort, one that involved both Elijah and Vanessa. And it was clear now that the web of lies, infidelity, and betrayal had reached its tragic conclusion. Whitney Caldwell had died not just because of a poisoned cup of tea, but because of the twisted actions of the people who had once been closest to her. Elijah had betrayed his wife in the most devastating way possible. And Vanessa, once a trusted member of the church, had become complicit in a murder that would leave the town of Magnolia Ridge reeling for years to come. As the case against Elijah Caldwell and Vanessa Hale grew stronger, the town of Magnolia Ridge braced itself for the trial. The once beloved pastor, the man who had preached about love, faith, and forgiveness, was now the focus of a murder investigation that would shake the very foundation of the community. The town was torn. Some still clung to the belief that Elijah was innocent, that he had been wronged by the system, while others were already certain of his guilt. The trial began with a chilling reminder of the stakes: the life of a young woman, a wife, a mother, taken too soon. Whitney Caldwell's family sat in the front rows, their grief raw and palpable. The jury, composed of 12 citizens of Magnolia Ridge, was tasked with deciding the fate of Elijah Caldwell. Would they find him guilty of his wife's murder, or would he walk free, his life as a pastor and community leader intact? The courtroom was tense as the prosecution presented its case. The evidence against Elijah was overwhelming. There was a receipt for the arsenic-based weed killer, purchased with his own credit card. There was the damning video footage showing him sneaking out of the church office late at night and driving to Vanessa Hale's home. There were the hundreds of text messages exchanged between Elijah and Vanessa in the days leading up to Whitney's death. And, of course, there was Vanessa's confession, in which she described how Elijah had come to her with a plan to kill his wife. Vanessa's testimony was particularly crucial. She admitted to being a willing participant in the murder, claiming that Elijah had convinced her that Whitney had to die for the sake of his future. Vanessa spoke of Elijah's desperation, his belief that he would lose everything: the church, his status, his reputation, if Whitney left him. Her words painted a chilling portrait of a man who had been willing to sacrifice his wife's life to preserve his own. In contrast, Elijah's defense team worked tirelessly to create doubt in the minds of the jurors. They argued that Elijah had been a devoted husband, that his grief at his wife's death was real, and that there was no direct evidence linking him to the poisoning. They suggested that someone else could have been responsible for Whitney's death, someone who had a vendetta against the pastor or the church. But the defense's arguments fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence. The arsenic, the affair, the confession, and the damning surveillance footage were enough to convince the jury. After just 4 hours of deliberation, the verdict was in. Elijah Caldwell was found guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted into silence as the judge read the verdict. Elijah's face was pale, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. His hand shook as he looked around the room, but there was no sign of the grief-stricken man who had once stood in front of his congregation, preaching about faith and forgiveness. Instead, he appeared a broken man, one who had been caught in a lie too enormous to hide. Vanessa Hale, on the other hand, was sentenced to 15 years in prison for her role in the murder. She had testified against Elijah in exchange for a plea deal, but the damage to her life and reputation was irreparable. Once a trusted member of the church, Vanessa was now a convicted criminal, her future uncertain. Elijah was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the end, Whitney Caldwell's death was not just the result of a poisoned cup of tea. It was the culmination of a series of choices, betrayals, and lies that had been building for months, if not years. And as Magnolia Ridge continued to heal from the shock of what had happened, one thing became clear. The dark and twisted truth was far more complicated than anyone could have ever believed.